Adaptation to climate change in developing countries. Lesson 3. Adaptation to climate change and adaptation policies. What shall we do to respond to climate change? We need to decrease greenhouse gases that cause climate change and adapt to impacts of climate changes. We need to do both. However, despite its importance, adaptation to climate change, when comparing with decrease of greenhouse gases, has received attention only recently. Especially as there are more impacts and damages from climate change, each country, in order to minimize risks and negative impacts of climate change and use positive impacts as opportunities, is establishing and implementing diverse adaptation policies. From this course, you can explain responses to climate change, concept of adaptation to climate change, and establishment of a plan to adapt to climate change. So, should we begin the course? 1. Responses to climate change. In order to respond to climate change, decrease of greenhouse gases, to mitigate climate change by decreasing emission of greenhouse gases that cause climate change, shall be in line with the adaptation to climate change to identify the areas, fields and classes that are vulnerable to damages and impacts of climate change, and establish short, mid, and long-term policies, meaning that the two must be balanced. Decrease in responses to climate change also means reduction and mitigation. This is to remove causes of climate change or decrease emission to reduce climate change as a strategy. It consists of estimation of emission of greenhouse gases, assessment and prediction. Reduction activities include the efforts to develop clean energy and green technologies and to reduce use of fossil fuels. Adaptation to climate change is a process to respond at the levels of individuals, civil society, local government, and the state with a purpose to protect communities from impacts on nature and human system. It is a strategy to overcome impacts of climate change. It focuses on responses to results of climate change and includes identification of impacts of climate change and behaviors to assess and predict vulnerabilities. Shall we sum up decrease of greenhouse gases and adaptation to climate change as a series of processes to respond to climate change? First, as greenhouse gases and aerosol are released and accumulated, there will be climate change such as temperature rise, increase of the sea surface level, change in precipitation, droughts, and floods. There will be adaptation activities to overcome the impacts on humans and natural system such as food, water resources, biodiversity, settlement environment, and health. Also, there will be socioeconomic development such as economic development, technology, population, and governance, and this will in turn affect adaptation and decrease of greenhouse gases. Then, shall we explore the characteristics of greenhouse gas reduction and adaptation and their differences in terms of various aspects such as spatial size, level of cooperation, cost bearer, and range of impacts? First, decrease of greenhouse gases is primarily to handle the causes of climate change. In order to suppress climate change on the global level, global cooperation will be needed. Also, it decreases both positive and negative impacts of climate change, promotes adaptation, and seeks long-term conveniences coming from suppression of climate change. Also, quantification of effects of reduction greenhouse gases and comparison of alternatives are available. At the same time, cost of greenhouse gas reduction is borne by sources of emission or at local levels. Mostly, it benefits others and promotes conveniences of the world and future generations. Mostly, responses will take place at energy, transportation, building, and industry levels. As for countries that are less vulnerable to climate change, there may be the free rider issues. Also, In general, incentives are needed while political urgency and legitimation are low. In comparison with greenhouse gas reduction, as explained above, adaptation to climate change is relevant to results of climate change primarily. In order to minimize damage of climate change at a local level, cooperation at the state and regional levels will be necessary. Also, it uses positive impacts of climate change, reduces negative impacts, and seeks short-term conveniences for reduction of vulnerabilities to climate change. Also, quantification of effects of greenhouse gas reduction is difficult, and there are cost-benefit differences by local conditions. At the same time, cost for climate change is borne at local levels, while benefits are given to those who have taken responsive measures, generating local benefits. Mostly, it will be relevant to urban planning, water, agriculture, health, and coastal areas. There may be inequity that causes damages on the part of those who have not caused climate change. Also, normally, incentives are not necessary for adaptation to climate change, while political urgency and legitimation are high. As explored, greenhouse gas reduction and adaptation are interrelated. They are of necessary and supplementary relations for responses to climate change. Reduction to decrease emission of greenhouse gases will diminish climate change, decreasing damages from climate change and saving time and cost necessary to cope with the impacts. Therefore, reduction of greenhouse gases is also referred to as the most proactive adaptation to climate change. 2. Concept of adaptation to climate change. Now let's explore the concept of adaptation to climate change. The report published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that provides scientific grounds for climate change policymaking has defined adaptation to climate change. The most recent Fifth Assessment Report, published in 2014, define adaptation as a process to take an appropriate behavior or an attitude to actual or expected climate and its effects, which is to mitigate, evade, or exploit harms of climate change in human systems. Also, the fourth IPCC Assessment Report defines adaptation as adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli, or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Many researchers define adaptation to climate change diversely. However, commonly, adaptation refers to changes in process, customs, or structures to reduce damages that may arise from climate change or use them as an opportunity. And it aims to minimize risk of climate change while maximizing opportunities. In addition, the concept of adaptability may be differently interpreted by area. For example, in ecology, adaptation is a change made by a living organism, or a species adapts to its own surrounding, while adaptation in social sciences refers to adjustments of collective behaviors of individuals and socioeconomic system. 3. Establishment of a plan to adapt to climate change. Following the concept of climate change, let's talk about establishing plans for adaptation. We will first explore why we need adaptation policies. Even if we decrease density of greenhouse gases to the level of 2000, the inertia of greenhouse gases will keep warming the globe with the remaining greenhouse gases, and impacts from this cannot be avoided. Therefore, it is important both to reduce emission of greenhouse gases and adapt to our changing environment. The UN Sustainable Development Summit 2015, held in September 2015 for the 70th conference, chose Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in which the goal for sustainable development includes take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. This reflects the urgency for adaptation to climate change. Despite the fact that there are definite symptoms related to impacts of climate change, for now, we still don't have much experience as to how to cope with such adaptation processes. The systemic risk assessment method to accurately predict who will be affected when and how is still unclear. What is certain is that the impacts of climate change are real, and they are more apparent for classes, areas, and regions where they have low adaptation capacity. Therefore, in relation to the impacts of climate change, although it is important to find scientific grounds as to how much impact will be on whom and when, it is necessary to remain prepared for climate change impacts even if we cannot guarantee accurate and clear results of our prediction. Adaptation to climate change is subjected to measures based on predicted impacts of climate change and will be established and implemented with uncertainty at its heart. Also, climate change is complexly affected by indirect impacts, such as socioeconomic elements, and its uncertainty becomes much bigger. Therefore, for adaptation, uncertainty shall be considered, and a great amount of cost will be invested for measures to be taken. This is why public sector, such as the state and local governments, establish and promote the policies rather than private sector, which aims at substantial economic profit generation. Among various solutions to climate change, adaptation policies in public realms include overall structures and processes of policies consisting of policy objectives, goals, indices, and behaviors that are arranged to reduce negative impacts and promote positive impacts of climate change. Just like there are various definitions of adaptation to climate change, adaptation policies are variously defined for each policy or by researcher. If so, what do we really need in our policies to adapt to climate change? In order to successfully adapt to future impacts of climate change, it is very important to define the scale of activities necessary and establish goals. It means that we need to establish and implement our adaptation policies. International communities and many countries have recognized the importance of adaptation to climate change, established and promoted strategies necessary to promote climate change. However, there have been limited discussion of overall goals as well as standards to define success or failure of adaptation. In general, and in a larger scale, adaptation is to minimize negative impacts of climate change and maximize positive impacts with an aim to secure recovery. Definition of successful adaptation differs by area and scholar. However, in common, it secures sustainability of environment, economy, and society while reducing vulnerabilities to climate change and risks. Therefore, successful adaptation can be defined as adjustments to reduce vulnerabilities to impacts of climate change and decrease related risks at a predetermined level while not damaging social, economic, and environmental sustainability. As explored above, goals of adaptation can be defined at various levels, such as maintenance of climate-related risks at the current level, reduction of risk if the current risks cannot be accepted, and minimization of vulnerabilities of the most vulnerable population. As for successes of goals of adaptation, various standards can be considered, such as impacts of adaptation, equity, recovery elasticity, cost effects, distribution of conveniences, efficiency, and legitimacy of adaptation. However, we still don't have a framework agreed to assess success or failure of adaptation of an environment where there are limited resources in the current situation of complex and uncertain characteristics of climate change, and there are various attempts underway. The 21st session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which took place in December, looked into greenhouse gas decrease and adaptation equally. In relation to adaptation, it established the common goals and roles of party countries to identify the global direction for adaptation. At the same time, It prescribes global implementation and inspection, such as review of appropriateness and effectiveness of adaptation support, and overall progress in the process of achievement of global goals. Following such international movements, our discussion of the goals of adaptation to climate change and the standards for successful adaptation will take place more actively in the future. Among other necessary elements to establish a successful plan, principles are a very important point to set up the direction of a plan. Therefore, we will look into matters that are considered important to establish a plan for adaptation to climate change. First, adaptation to climate change shall take place within a sustainable framework, where there are harmony and balance of economy, society, and environment. It means that adaptation to climate change shall take place in a way to make a balance among economic growth, social stability, and integration and environmental conservation while satisfying the needs of the current and the future generations. Second, it is necessary to consider the classes that are vulnerable to climate change when establishing an adaptation plan. The impacts of climate change occur more significantly to vulnerable classes, areas and regions which must be first managed in terms of risk of climate change, followed by increase of equity by distributing conveniences and benefits of adaptation. Third, efficiency and effectiveness of an adaptation plan shall be reinforced. Among diverse alternatives for adaptation, urgency and elasticity shall be reviewed from comprehensive and integrated perspectives, and measures shall be prioritized. Fourth, there shall be climate change risk management and response based on scientific grounds, knowledge and technologies. Climate risk shall be managed from the perspective of precautionary approach based on the information pertaining to potential impacts of climate change and vulnerability in consideration of uncertainty of climate change. Fifth, adaptation to climate change such as revision and supplementation of existing policies, structures and processes shall be mainstreamed in consideration of adequacy to and relations with existing policies and institutional conditions. Sixth, inappropriate adaptation shall be prevented, while common benefits of adaptation and reduction shall be maximized. Also, adaptation shall take place in a way to counterbalance conflicts over long-term and short-term application, as well as adaptation and reduction policies. Seventh, systemic and continuous monitoring and evaluation feedback system shall be arranged to manage performance of adaptation to climate change. At the same time, participation and communication of related stakeholders shall be fortified. This time, we will look into the procedures and processes to establish a climate change adaptation plan. So far, there has been various research on economic effects of mitigation of climate change and response strategies based on reduction of greenhouse gases following the climate change agreements. The number of research or reports related to adaptation to climate change is relatively very small. Most of the adaptation-related research has their limits to provide in-depth results in terms of prioritization of adaptation policies and on-site approaches. The process of adaptation to climate change is divided into establishment of goals, survey, decision-making, materialization, and evaluation. The stage to establish a goal will be determined by how they implement to achieve a goal, and which achievements are sought by a decision-maker through adaptation. The survey stage is to evaluate liabilities and institutional assets that prevent or convenience policy implementation and adaptation plans. For example, this stage effectively shows evaluation of the capacity to adapt. The decision-making process includes participation of stakeholders, harmony with existing policy structures, prioritization of different adaptation options, evaluation of effects, vulnerabilities and risks, climate assessment, and preferred adaptive responses. Materialization and evaluation stage relates to assignation of roles and responsibilities, removal of barriers and implementation of adaptation options, including and preferring communication. It includes sub-level processes related to evaluation and monitoring of implementation. In relation to establishment of the Plan for Adaptation to Climate Change, UNDP, and climate change, the UK programme published reports suggesting procedures and systems and presented approaches to establish an adaptation system. UNDP Climate Change Adaptation Policy, also known as APF, mostly was established to construct domestic response system in developing countries and evaluate various plans and policy processes. However, it is also used as a directive to conform to long-term sustainable development strategies. It is to identify approaches and effects necessary to implement various response projects to adapt to climate change rather than climate change as a phenomenon itself. It suggests provision of project scope and objective, project teaming, review and summation of existing information on vulnerabilities, and adaptation and design of a specific project while specifying and prescribing approaches through detailed implementation plans pertaining to each process. Also, APF consists of the 4 principles: responses to short-term climate change and responses to long-term vulnerabilities to climate change. Selection of adaptive policy means in terms of economic development, consideration of local characteristics in adaptation policies, and harmonization of adaptation strategies and policy implementation processes. Processes consist of 7 elements, from design of climate change adaptation project to participation of stakeholders and adaptive processes. First, as for the first stage pertaining to project scope and designation, scopes and objectives of individual projects to implement adaptation policies, project teaming, review and summation of existing information on vulnerability, and adaptation and project implementation design will be included. For this, primarily, identification and participation of stakeholders related to adaptation projects shall take place. Stakeholders will play a role to provide various opinions and feedback over overall projects as a direct and indirect project principle. At the third stage, vulnerability assessment, major methodologies are applied to quantify adaptation to and risk of climate change. Major methodologies include climate risk approach to analyze a specific climate risk, current or future vulnerability approach aimed at effects of future climate risk, policy analysis including changes to degree of advance exposure to risk and response to sensitivity changes, and adaptability approach, studying overall economic and social capacity. The fourth stage, assessment of current climate risk, vulnerability and adaptation, covers climate risk and potential impacts. Socioeconomic evaluation, assessment of adaptability, including policies and various measures, and assessment of socioeconomic conditions and climate vulnerabilities. The fifth stage, future climate risk assessment, is to forecast the future socioeconomic and environmental conditions and assess risks and vulnerabilities pertaining to climate change. This covers long-term inclinations and trends of climate change, prospect of other related elements, changes and opportunities of socioeconomic conditions, characteristics of changes of natural resources and environment, and prospect for opportunities and barriers related to responses. On the other hand, judgment of factors that affect commonly at various stages in relation to implementation of adaptive policies is very important. Especially, spontaneous participation of stakeholders is a very important element for successful implementation of ADF. First of all, in terms of designation of project scope, identification and interest of stakeholders are important. Also, in the current and the future climate change risk assessment, common interests and conflicts of stakeholders, professional and regional representation, and evaluation of future prospects can be understood to pertain to stakeholders. Now, let's explore the UK CIP, Climate Change, the UK Programme. This is a program that started in 1997 to assess impacts of climate change and establish national adaptive strategies. Based on the steering committee consisting of governmental ministries, public institutions, private sector, and NGO representatives, it conducts research to derive climate change impact assessment by area and field and provides adaptive measures. The UK CIP defines adaptation to climate change as an action to respond to changing climate-led phenomena and greenhouse gases. It defines climate change risk as a combination of the possibility to derive the result and the knowledge of its size. It offers climate change risk decision-making support system, which is a climate change risk management framework to reduce climate change risks and uncertainty. This consists of 8 stages, enabling each stage policy analysis and assessment from problem identification and goal setting to monitoring. At the first stage, problems and objectives will be recognized. There will be definitions as to major factors requiring decision-making, and if climate change will pose a risk to projects and programs at the second stage, standards for decision-making will be established. The standards for decision-making shall include uncertain alternatives rather than performance, convenience of implementation, cost, equity, official approval, and social acceptability, and there shall be consideration of final decision-makers. At the third stage, risk assessment, elements relevant and irrelevant to climate change will be divided for risk assessment. At the fourth stage, the policy direction and measure stage, whether to establish irrevocably strong adaptive measures or to arrange mild adaptive measures that may involve a regret or provide win-win measures or flexible alternatives, and the question if the policies shall be delayed or removed in the first place will be decided in order to set the policy directions and measures. At the fifth stage, policy direction and measure assessment, appropriate judgment standards pertaining to adaptive measures, and the fourth stage will be combined with the risk assessment information under the third stage in order to assess policies based on them. At the sixth stage, final policies will be decided in consideration of application of other standards, such as weight in selection of clearly preferred measures and others. At the seventh stage, matters decided at the sixth stage will be implemented. At the eighth stage, implementation will be monitored, which is to assess problem solving at the first stage and achievement of goals. This will be reflected on all stages again, which is a feedback process. Summary. Let's review and summarize what we've learned so far. We learned about adaptation to climate change and adaptation policies. We will learn about domestic policies of adaptation to climate change next time. Goodbye.